Really an honor and pleasure to be able to moderate this panel today. Today we've talked about student voice in a number of educational contexts. And I'm really excited now, given the expertise of everyone on the panel, to talk about it specifically in the context of mathematics and mathematics environments. So I'll moderate a 40-minute panel discussion among the speakers, then we'll have 15 minutes of audience Q&A, and of course I'll be prioritizing student voice. I want to ask the panelists to just go ahead and introduce yourself with just your names and institutions or organizations. And Nathan, we'll start down there with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nathan Alexander from Morehouse College.
Na'ilah Nasir from the Spencer Foundation.
Hi, folks. Dan Meyer from Desmos.
Hello. My name is Elham Kazemi from the University of Washington.
All right, thanks for those introductions. I'd like to start by giving you each a chance to share just some opening thoughts on the theme of today's events. So can you reflect on why it's important to focus on student voice in mathematics? And I know some of you brought artifacts, so we will pull those up as you're talking, but that's why we have you going in a specific order. So Na'ilah, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Oh, I was first, okay.
Yes.
So my artifact is kind of a story, and as I was thinking about it, I don't know that it's about student voice, but I think it's about the precursor of the way we orient to students that creates the space for student voice. So I spent some time with a math department at a school that's kind of fictitiously called Railside High School. Railside High School is kind of legendary in math education circles for its equity work, that over a period of about 20 years, they developed an equity pedagogy that essentially obliterated gaps by gender and race between freshman year and senior year. So kids come in with gaps in math and leave without those gaps. And there's a whole lot of work we did to figure out like why that was, and many researchers studied them, blah, blah, blah. So I was at a research conference where this group of teachers was presenting. And they were doing, I don't remember what the conference was. It was someplace like up in the Berkeley Hills, like way remote. And they were doing a demonstration lesson. And so it was the teachers and the students in groups, like some maybe subset of students, maybe 16 students or so, and they went through this entire lesson with this audience of researchers, including Bob Moses, who's kind of the godfather of race, culture, and math learning. And they went through this demonstration lesson, and the students left, and everybody kind of debriefed. Long story short, there was a kid, an African-American young man, who came late to the demonstration lesson. And it was kind of like the teachers laughed about it because they were like, he comes late to class every day. Like, how does he also manage to come late to this demonstration lesson that's like 10 miles from campus? And Bob Moses was not amused. Bob Moses was like, this is egregious. Why are you all allowing this student to disrupt the norms and come late to class? And the teachers told this story about him, that he had recently lost his mother and that he came late to class because he walked his girlfriend to class first. And what they understood is that his needing to have that kind of solid social emotional grounding meant that when he got to class, he could focus differently. And that to me is just a beautiful example of what it means to have classrooms that make the space for students to be full human beings. That it's not just about the rules and the structures but actually for this kid to show up, he needed to feel connected first. And they kind of made the space for that to happen. So that's my opening thought.
Thank you.
That wasn't too long.
No. Elham, we'll ask you to go next.
Well, I have some stories as well. And when I first began teaching, I wanted to make my classroom the joyful, lively place that teachers want to make them. And one day, we had a writing exercise, and a student of mine was visibly upset. And I thought, like, you get to write about your own ideas and you get to write about everything that you want. What's there to be upset about? And I don't know really why I asked him this, but I said he was really getting increasingly upset. And we had a side conversation. I sort of asked him if he would come talk to me. Maybe we stepped outside. Now it's been too long for me to remember what. But I'll never forget his words because I said, could you just tell me a little bit about what writing is to you? And through clenched teeth, he said, writing is dragging a wooden instrument across a piece of paper. I was like, oh, yeah, that's not this writing prompt. That's not this assignment. We've got a whole set of other things I need to understand about you in order for us to write. And when I went to graduate school at UCLA and met Megan Franke and began my career as a math educator, I think what I was attracted to her work is that it was all about listening to children's thinking and that children had ideas, and the classroom was not a space for us to design things. It wasn't about us, it was really about them, I suppose. And time again, I've been taught by kids, and I've been surprised by what they're experiencing in the classroom, despite what our intentions are for the kind of learning environment that we have. So whether it's stories that have been documented by researchers or the time I've spent in classrooms, there's so much to learn about what they're experiencing. So I like to lead discussions with children. I think sharing your ideas is amazing. But kids have taught me that participating in discussions isn't always so great. There was a young boy who taught me that sharing your thoughts, your private thinking out loud in front of other people is not something that one should do. Why are you asking me to do that? That's not why I thought he wasn't raising his hand. So I find that in order to give space to students, you actually have to sit and stay a while, and you have to figure out how to be in genuine relationship with them. And that's really not easy. And you have to expand beyond yourself and your own experience in a way that will enrich your own humanity, but I think will help you pursue lots of different ways to support students and to think about growth, because what it means for a student to grow may be different than what you think it means to grow.
Thank you. Dan, I'll ask you to go next and just make sure we pull up your slides.
Yeah, first I just want to say thank you so much for letting me learn with you folks today. It's been a real privilege, and I'm so excited to learn a bit more about student voice in a discipline that often seems by stereotype to be pretty hostile to student voice, math versus, say, the humanities. That'll be a thrill, too. I work at a ed tech startup called Desmos, and we are very skeptical about ed tech, especially in light of just the deluge of these plastic devices in classes now, and their capacity to both inhibit and amplify student voice almost equally. And that's dependent on how people who build the technology answer the question, what are these things good for anyway? And so we've answered that question, and we say that these computers are good for new modes of creative mathematical expression, similar to how they've enabled expression of different sorts outside of the classroom, and then also new ways to connect students to each other and to teachers through their ideas in the same way that we connect with each other outside of the classroom in these new ways. And what that results in for us, we measure our work based on how well it enables students to be right and wrong in different interesting ways. A lot of math ed tech, you can be right and wrong, and right in one way if you click the right multiple choice item, and wrong in like 3 different ways, but not very interesting ways. And so what we have here, for example, is students are trying to create a parabola that goes through these slaloms right here. And even in an abstract situation like this, there are different ways to be right and wrong, different creative mathematical expressions from students that then we build tools that allow teachers to, for instance, snapshot what students have done, these different ways of being right. Take these snapshots. If you're a student of the 5 practices for productive mathematical discussions, you'll recognize this kind of pedagogy. And teachers can then position these student voices, these contributions, and voice here means like an abstract equation is just a form of expression, and ask like, how are these the same? How are they different? And host conversations about mathematical expressions like that. We also create the ability for students to create challenges for each other. So after trying a few of these that we've created, we say to students, all right, you decide if you want to do 1, 2, 3, or 4 slalom gates, and you position them where you want to. And then after you've solved your own challenge, you and a partner, it goes into this class gallery where students solve each other's challenges. This is a very unusual use for math ed tech in the current paradigm of how it's used typically. And so we see, here's some quotes from students when we ran this in a class as they interacted with each other's contributions to their class dialogue around this mathematics. We make students solve their own challenge so they can't create a rock that they themselves, so large that they themselves can't lift it. But we just to notice that technology's enabled students to create for each other these mathematical self-expressions that in it should not be surprising to me or us, but it is to me anyway, that how much more they enjoy participating in problems created by each other than in problems created by Desmos, who no one knows in the classroom, and then, or even their teacher, just their own contributions as a source of mathematical voice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Nathan.
So at Morehouse College, I run the Communicating Teams program. And Communicating Teams, the team stands for Thinking Effectively About Mathematics. And so every semester I hire about 15 TAs, and I work with them in the evenings to train them how to work with their peers. What's resulted from that is me learning to be vulnerable and giving away my own voice in exchange for other student voices. And so this is an image of them at our annual math fair. It happens at midterms and then fall. And so the students at the board right now are TAs. This is actually one of our seniors, Joshua Sparks. He's a math teacher now in Texas. And he studied math education at Spelman and Morehouse. And he was sort of a leader in terms of this transition from teacher voice to student voice. And I think part of that for me and the learning for me was really listening to students. I think that's what I said about the power. I think we hear students, but really listening to what they need is something different. And what I was hearing was that you explain it like a math teacher sometimes, and we need other people, like other ways to think about it. And I think the more I listened, the more I was able to sit back and let students come up. And so this is sort of one of the outcomes of that. These are some more students here. They're doing error analysis. And so one of the strong things about, I think, our math department is just sort of building these cultures of, I think, student work, and then using that work to sort of move us all forward. So this is an image of students doing an error analysis. And what that is basically what are some common mistakes that students make, and how can we help them to learn from those mistakes? And I'll talk about social justice math and teaching math for social justice a little bit later, but this is our summer program, and our students are working on some graphs here. And we deal with a few different social issues, but what I wanted to share about this particular image, these students, this is their third year in our summer program, and they had really bad experiences in their high schools in math. And I think just giving them another topic that's sort of mathematical in its sense, but something else to think about. I've seen them sort of grow over 3 years. But I'm happy to say that two of the students here are really interested in sort of figuring out how to use math more in their life. And I think it just came from really redirecting how we think about the uses of math beyond, I think, having students solve for X or Y or finding some solution to an equation. And I get to do that over the summertime, sort of really play around with my ideas. And so, yeah, I think those are the artifacts. And I think what I've learned through all three photos is sort of the real importance of, as a teacher, vulnerability and sort of what that does to you emotionally, for a student to interrupt you and say, I don't get what you're saying, and for you to have to step aside and let one of your students come up and do a better job sometimes. But it really creates that community that we talk about in a way that I don't know if I was ready for, but it's sort of been a really growth in terms of my own pedagogy.
Next, I'm really excited to dig into some more specific aspects of how student voice shows up in your work and what you're learning about it. So Dan, I'm going to start with you this time. How does piquing students' curiosity help teachers connect to students and help students connect to mathematics? And how does this reflect a shift in thinking about mathematics instruction?
Yeah, I'm just not sure that curiosity is really a mandate for curriculum developers, really. It's a lot of it's about how efficiently can you tell the topic, basically, impart the skill, let's say. And so what we're excited by is creating more room for student voice. Like the room for student voice in a lot of curricula is like, do you know the operation your teacher just modeled in front of you? Can you take this problem that has these numbers and put them in the right formula? Can the answer is accurate, quickly, that sort of thing. And so we're just so excited to use digital media to create room for curiosity, which we hope leads to expressions of student voice. For instance, you might see in a math textbook a problem that's contextual, but the context has been pre-mathematized to, down to the last inch. So like someone is going through a grocery store line, and their path through the line is modeled by the function d of t equals 14 minus 5. They have t items, like that sort of thing. And there's room to implement the procedure, the end. And we're excited by the power of digital media to create conditions of curiosity leading to student voice, whereby we just show an image or a video of the situation. possible now in ways that wasn't 20 years ago. And so students can see the grocery store or the local bodega or whatever. There's multiple lines, and we can ask students, so which line would you get into and why? Seeing these different kind of carts there, some are heaping, some are small. There's lots of carts here. And to allow for students then, without any math on the screen, no measurements, no formulas there, but just a site for contextual home-based knowledge to enter in. And students can say, well, that one, there's just one cart there, I'd go there. And this one says, well, there's like, these 4 carts have very few items, but I know that you gotta like say hello and goodbye every time, and that adds up over those 4 carts. Like, there's just no room for that in typical curricula. And so I've heard so many themes throughout the day of co-construction of spaces for students and teachers. And we love co-constructed lessons where through digital media, I can celebrate student informal and home knowledge about grocery stores. I can ask for estimation about how long it'll take and then slowly mathematize that space with them. All right, here's the info about these 4 carts. Now what do you know? What are you gonna do with this? That just doesn't happen with print-based curriculum. It doesn't happen in a lot of typical curriculum. And I would just say in closing that really important curiosity is not so much student curiosity, but teacher curiosity about what their students wonder. Because if we give this room for curiosity, but teachers don't care enough to wonder what students are thinking about their local bodega or whatever, it does nobody any good.
That's a good segue. You're next. I was going to ask you if you could tell us what you've learned in your work related to helping educators to teach in ways that build on students' assets and mathematical sense-making.
Yes. So actually this morning, my classes to teach future teachers is at an elementary school. We spend 5 hours there, and the reason we spend 5 hours there is that we work with a group of teachers, one class and a group of kids, who we come to be our collective class over the course of the entire quarter. And part of becoming curious about kids is coming to know particular kids and their particular stories, and being invited in a space with them to be our teachers. And so we use some of the tasks that Dan just described to open up our teachers' eyes to what kids are wondering about, what they can do mathematically, and we do that in a very collective and public space. And a lot of the professional learning that we do in schools in the area is also through that same kind of model. So recently, just last Friday, we were in a school where we wanted to run what are called hands-down conversations, where the children sit in a circle, and there's a really intriguing prompt that they talk about, but they facilitate the discussion themselves. It's a really great idea, but learning how to do that and what your role is as a teacher on the side, it takes a lot of intentionality, and you have to listen very carefully to what kids are saying to one another. But one of the things we did in this very first time is just see what this group of 3rd graders would do with the prompt. And we just observed how much silence there was. We looked for nonverbal gestures. We looked for who talked and how often. And as much as the teachers did want to jump in, what was great in our collective efforts to plan and try this out together is that we kept urging each other with our eyes, don't say anything. And there was one long 3-minute silence among the kids when they were just looking at each other. And what was happening between them was really phenomenal. So first of all, the kids who had already spoken had a sense that they shouldn't go again. So they were also urging each other, like we were urging each other not to speak, they were urging each other to speak. And then you saw the nonverbals, that they were actually gesturing to each other. And then you saw some kids do this, because there was a partner saying to them, and they were like, no. And then they erupted in giggling. Giggling, giggling, giggling. And from that giggling, somebody finally spoke and said something that spurred the conversation on forward. And for us to have that experience together as a group of teachers with our own students is the kind of learning environment that we've sort of co-constructed with teachers to learn together, to break open the privacy of teaching and try out so many wonderful ideas and resources that are out there, but with our particular kids in particular contexts.
So what outcomes have been observed when culturally inclusive mathematics is enacted? And what do you want this audience to understand about this approach? And in particular, what things are not well understood or often misunderstood?
start with some general principles and then you can be specific. So I guess I wanted to start with the part about what's generally not understood. And I think that we have this frame that culture and learning matter for brown people, right? And I maintain scientifically learning is inherently cultural for everyone, right? It's just that schools are set up to be predominantly Eurocentric and middle class centric, and so the cultural nature of learning goes invisible, right? But learning as a process happens with social others, in culturally constructed environments, towards culturally organized ends and goals. It is inherently cultural in nature. We learn, you alluded to this a minute ago, we learn by connecting the new things we learn onto the old things we already know, which come from our participation in cultural practices across the spaces of our lives, right? So, and if that's true, then culturally relevant or culturally responsive pedagogy should actually just be the norm. It should actually be just good pedagogy. And we have to call it something because it happens so rarely for Black, brown, and low-income students. I would also just add, kind of by way of principle, that we also know that when school communities set equity as a goal and put the structures and practices in place to make that happen, learning happens. So it's not this thing that we can't attain. And then for a wonderful example.
I'll give another story that sort of relates to what Na'ilah is talking about. So Morehouse College is a historically Black male institution, founded in the 1800s, obviously, when slaves were emancipated. And from a cultural lens, in terms of thinking from the racial side, we think about the history and the legacy and sort of what that means pedagogically. It's like a huge boarding school. We have about 2,000 students. I think what that does in a classroom space is not only are you teaching students, but you sort of know what's going on in the dorms because there's an email that went around from the administrators. You see your students walking down Brown Street. And I think it sort of creates this environment where it's impossible almost in terms of my own teaching to separate the two, where my students' lives and my lives become sort of one in the classroom. I think in terms of the pedagogical aspects and sort of the teaching, it's really providing that room for students to show up. And so I'm thinking about the story that you talked about with the students sort of showing up late. It's like, what does that mean, in terms of a math classroom? Why are we here? What is the point? Is it for you to learn this, this tool or strategy, or is it for you to come and learn something for your longer term goals? I think a lot of what I talked about in the introduction about vulnerability is something that I value, and sort of accountability with that vulnerability. So it creates these conditions where students get to hold me accountable, I get to hold them accountable, but we also have sort of some love underlying that. I think in a math classroom, they're not used to that. Most of my students come and say, oh, I've never experienced a math course like
And
this.
can I just interject here that there was a picture of Nathan that went viral on social media with him holding a baby in a carrier that was the student's baby. You all may recognize him of Twitter fame. Thought I would just throw that in there.
So that's some of that vulnerability at play, I think. So since it's a small enough room, I'll tell everyone the backstory. That student was actually coming to skip class. And he was using the baby as an excuse. And I said, no, you have an exam coming. And I was really excited to hold the baby. But it worked. I think in the moment, I think it showed students that, hey, I can let my professor know when some things are going on. And I saw that practice sort of just topple over the last couple of months, where students are, I think, just comfortable being in a math classroom, and we're able to start learning. And I'll add to that, in this particular course, it's college algebra. This is a first-year course where students are sort of expected to learn all of high school math in a semester. And so the conditions are not such that we get to sort of just hang out and love on each other, right? We have pathways. If they're going to take their next math class, they have to be prepared with this definition. And so there's a really interesting day to day. So I teach every day. It's very busy, but I love it. But there's a very interesting mechanism too. We have class time. I'm usually there in the evenings. And I think when I imagine sort of what I want math education to look like, I think it's just us removing that veil for our students and saying I'm a human too. So they see me eat in my office because I want to tutor them. And I think if more educators and teachers sort of allow students to just show up to that point, I think we sort of start to see what culture is and that it is the norm. It's what happens when we go home, right? With our own families and our own loved ones. And we want to really bring those into our spaces where we teach.
Yeah, and I think there's an interaction between the humanizing practices in classrooms and the structures we set up to allow those humanizing structures to have a place. Like I was talking with someone earlier about Railside and making the point that they had these amazing outcomes. One of the important parts of their structure was to have the math classes taught in block periods, not just because that allowed more space in the context of a classroom session to do deeper, more critical, more engaged mathematical thinking, change the tasks you could give, but also because then a semester they were essentially covering a full year's worth of content in a semester. That meant if you started with algebra, you could make it to calculus by senior year. That meant if you flunked geometry, you could make it to calculus by senior year. So this part of it that was built into the structure to allow opportunities for failure and redemption was also actually really important. And that was combined with the humanizing strategies that happened in classroom spaces with teachers. They had a philosophy of, find the thing the smart kids are dumb at, find the things the dumb kids are smart at, right? Like, so disrupting status hierarchies, changing what it meant to think and do mathematics. Like, not just inviting people into a discipline that stayed static, but actually reinterpreting the discipline in ways that made the work of it more interesting and humanized it.
Thank you. What types of supports and opportunities have you found help the pre-service teachers you've worked with to think differently about some of the issues that have come up in our conversation so far?
Well, I think what's interesting about the structure of our preparation systems too is sort of everything is disconnected from one another, and I think we have to work on changing our structures. So the conversations they have about understanding schools and society and the cultural foundations of learning have to come into their disciplinary work, and sometimes they sort of put those happen at the beginning of the program, and then they're like, so now I'm going to learn how to teach. But of course, all of those ideas about what is fundamentally learning, how are classrooms racialized and gendered and classed, and what does that mean for your interactions with particular kids at the same time that you're teaching mathematics, it's sort of being able to have those experiences together. So I think in part that's why I realized I couldn't just be in a class at a university talking about teaching. We had to kind of talk about particular children and their lives, and how do we understand their experiences across the school day, not just in mathematics. What does it mean to connect with their families? What does it mean to come to know the whole child in relation to mathematics teaching and learning? It's just a really tall order. It means we sort of have to rethink the way that we do teacher preparation and ongoing professional learning, because it's only just the beginning of a really hard job where you constantly have to be learning and expanding what you understand. And you have to have your own personally different experiences in order to do the kinds of things that we're talking about.
Dan, I already see you reflecting, so
Sorry, got lost there. That was amazing.
so feel free to build on that or respond to it. I'm going to ask, what do you think most curriculum and product and tool developers, including Desmos, don't yet understand and need to learn from the conversation we've had today?
Yeah, I just want to be really explicit with ourselves and other people about what we think computers are good for. Without being explicit and intentional about that, computers just wind up reproducing a lot of really lousy logic and structures in classes and schools. They find, a lot of folks answer that question, what are these good for, by saying, well, they're good for posing problems that computers can assess quickly, which leads to certain kind of questions being privileged, which reproduces certain kinds of, Eurocentric logic around precision being valued and, kind of right and wrong binary distinctions like that. we need to be more explicit about that. We walk into classes where computers are on the desks one-to-one, and you wind up seeing very individualistic models of instruction being enacted, where like you have students that have headphones on. My team, is inspired a lot by Zaretta Hammond's work, where she advances this idea of classes and cultures being collectivistic and individualistic, and computers wind up tending towards individualism so often. So just working against that, they often reproduce a culture of compliance versus creativity. The challenges that we're working with, and why I was just reacting to Elham's comments, and what I've reacted to a lot of sessions I've been in, is just how complex the work is and how many different stakeholders there are. Just when I think I was a K-12 teacher and I've been in the university levels, and I have a certain kind of lens, I feel like I have a decent handle on some of the complexity and some of the actors in this world, but then I'm just like constantly surprised every session by someone bringing up, well, civic leaders and other kinds of people who have a huge effect on students' education. So that's the advice that I'm trying to take from this space here back to my team, is to think about like, who are we not interacting with our work?
What do you think most mathematics educators don't yet understand and need to learn from the conversation we've had today?
There was someone right before lunch that talked about just reminding ourselves of this pathway from equality to equity, equity to justice, and really thinking about what we mean when we say justice. I focus a lot on just thinking about the future of Black people, Black futurity, and what justice looks like for, in the United States context, a group that's been just sort of marginalized. When we add to that intersectionality, I think we have to really imagine, and I forget who it was. Is it Elham from Michigan? She talked about putting your money where your mouth is and put your power, putting your power where your mouth is. I think that really touched me because I struggle a lot in spaces like this because I realize that with such access comes privilege, but also there's a silence there because us continuing these practices allow, I think, the inequities that we experience to continue as well. And I think really challenging ourselves about what that means from a practical sort of set of outcomes and attaching that to the future, sort of where are we going, it really shifts sort of, are we willing, to your point, to put ourselves on the line for our students? And what does that mean in terms of our own survival? And I think that's something that I really want folks to really think about in terms of what's happening from the societal standpoint right now. Like, who would you have been if you look historically, and we're thinking about schools, who would you have been 200 years ago? Are we complicit in certain ways, and how do we push back in ways that really matter to the words that we say? And that's, I think, just a matter of personal development that I think when you add it to the putting power where your mouth is, really gives us some strength to think about justice and what that means on a day-to-day, because there are people that are struggling today.
Actually, I think this last, Na'ilah, I'm going to turn to you. Last question kind of connects to all these questions of power, privilege, bringing in another lens. So obviously you're a leading scholar in this area, but you're also a funder. So I'm going to ask you to put that hat on for this last question. How are you thinking about some of the issues we've touched on in this conversation in your foundation's grant making, both in terms of what you fund and how?
Ooh, I could talk for so long. And maybe I'll preface it to say, I think I, along with many in my field, were quite surprised that I was named president of the Spencer Foundation, partly because Spencer has a history that's it's very mainstream. It's a very mainstream foundation. It funds education research. It's very rigorous, and it doesn't have a strong, solid reputation with communities of scholars of color that are doing really critical work. Let me just say that. We've already dug into a lot of that work. I've been there 2.5 years now. One of the first set of things we did, and I'll talk about both the content of our funding and the process of our funding, because they're actually connected, and when you're thinking about equity and justice, both process and content are really important. With respect to process, we have overhauled all of our grant making to ensure that every proposal that comes in the door gets feedback. Why that's important is that our process initially gave about the top 30% of proposals feedback. So if your proposal made it to a final round, then you got something about what was great about it or what didn't work about it. But if you got rejected in the first round, you actually had no idea why. And so it meant that the proposals that were weakest got the least support in getting stronger. And so we've kind of recrafted our identity as a foundation to say we are actually about developing the field, and thus we're going to spend the time and the energy to give feedback to every proposal that comes in the door. Along with that, we made some pretty big changes to our process to who is reviewing proposals to ensure that our review panels are incredibly diverse, both disciplinarily, with respect to the background of the scholars, with respect to their scholarship, in a way that we hope gives a fairer shake to a wider range of proposals. And then I'll talk a little bit about the content. We've been working on a couple of new initiatives, one around cultivating equitable education spaces, so an initiative with equity at the core, bringing together scholars from across the field to think about what's the cutting edge, what do we need to be going as a field, not just as individual people running individual projects, but what's the cutting edge of the field. And a second initiative that's connected is around intersections between human learning and thriving. So how do we think about learning in ways that are broader than just how someone's able to show up with, on a test score? What does it look like if we really think about learning with the full richness of what we've been talking about today? What would the research agenda look like for the future there? And a couple of kind of really specific things. One that's on my mind is about assessments. That we actually don't assess learning in the ways that allow us to understand the things that we care about most. We assess learning to help us in ways that allow us to know the thing we can know, but it's not the thing we want to know or the thing we need to know. And I think that's really important, and we'll be thinking about that moving forward. The second thing is just a major realization that so many of our studies and paradigms really have at their core deficit perspectives of children, of families, of youth, of communities, and they're baked in. Like they're baked into the research methods, they're baked into the theories. And so how we think about new methods, new theories that don't reproduce ideologies that assume there's something wrong with particular communities, with particular families, with particular children, I think is also really, it's kind of an essential research question in a way that I don't think I quite realized before.
The thing that's a little bit hard, I mean, I have been studying children's thinking for a while, so I know some stuff, but there's a lot that I really don't understand and can't do by myself and don't know by myself unless I'm with other people talking. Things about language development, I taught 5th grade. There's a lot to learn about working with kindergartners and first graders that I can't possibly know. There are lots of different languages and cultures and races, and there's all kinds of student needs in classrooms that are beyond my own personal experience. So part of partnering with the teacher is that we, and each other, whether we're working with pre-service teachers or practicing teachers, is that we have to bring our whole selves into that experience too. And usually we are astounded and learn all kinds of new things from the practices that the teachers are using themselves. But we seek people who want to put kids' experiences at the heart of their teaching. And that is like the starting point. So that we can engage in that mutuality. But each year we sort of stretch ourselves with things that we haven't done before. I really wanted our students to have a way to connect with families in ways that is not typical in like a methods class. And we just take little baby steps. Like one year we just wrote notes home. Like and then we sent pictures home. And then last year, 2 years ago when I taught, I was like, is there any way that we could invite some families to come like hang out with us just for like an hour? But that's, that's a little baby step. And then you're like, well, what else can you do? And what's interesting about something like that is the families describe their kids, if you're parents, your children are so different at home than they're at school. And the stories they tell and the desires they have, like when the parents say, what do you want for your kids? Like everyone says, I just want my kid to be happy and successful. It's not like, oh, I really want them to learn their whatever thing in math. And I think for young teachers or early career teachers to see that that's that's the first thing that families say about their kids, and then how much they enjoy telling stories about their children too. It kind of changes like, well, what is it to me in partnership with families? And so these experiences just keep stretching and stretching and stretching. And I think we're now at a point where we are ready to redesign again because there's issues across the program. And then that's kind of what makes it fun and cool.
So I created a curriculum with the SMASH program, which is Summer Math and Science Honors Academy. And we have SMASH Morehouse. And so part of the center of that curriculum is removing the instructor or the facilitator and sort of really centering students. I think that first step is having students in the room when you're developing and co-creating. And so I think what we do in terms of just getting and ensuring that their voice is there is asking them sort of what it is that they desire. And then we bring our own expertise in. And so I think at the very initial step, if students are not in the room, the process has already sort of started off in a way that doesn't center and value their voices. I think when you actually get to the curriculum writing, I think it's constantly writing and revising and checking in with those students and teaching them about things. And so I think there's like YPAR, Youth Participatory Action Research. If there were to sort of be a curriculum, I don't know if there is, maybe someone knows, like a curriculum that parallel that process, I think that would really ensure that students are sort of central to the curriculum writing process in ways that they value. So I used to teach teachers when I was a faculty member in the School of Education, and we used to read this article by Michael Apple. It's like, does a national curriculum make sense? And that it would generate a lot of discussions. I'm of the nature that community matters and the local context, but I do think that there are ways to think about broadly sort of what are the things that we value, particular to math for me. And I think allowing teachers, so if I could sort of think of reimagine teaching and teacher preparation, it should be like what we do at a university, right? No one's coming to ask me what I'm teaching tomorrow when I get in my classroom. My department chair really doesn't really care, right? He just wants to know that I'm doing a job and I'm getting the students through. I think when we empower teachers, it does become scalable because they become people that now can actually inform what they know about their students, and it actually gives them some intentionality behind that process.
Can I add one brief exercise for teachers? Teaching is so hard that it really, I value like push-ups for educators that we can offer teachers to help develop them over a career, over a year and more. So one of them is to recognize that print curricula fundamentally limits one's ability to co-construct because it needs to have all of the information, all the structures that it will ever need to be printed in advance. So it limits that. So one really effective exercise for teachers in PLCs, department meetings, is to just take a problem from next week's work and to systematically cover up parts of it. Cover up the numbers, cover up the initial sentence, cover up the question, and to ask jointly what opportunities for student voice and co-construction does this allow that wasn't there before. So if the question's gone, I can now ask students, what questions do you wonder based on this context? If the numbers and information aren't there, I can ask students, so like what info would help us answer this question? And on and on and on, and just routinizing in small weekly 10-minute exercises with just adults in a room, this very complex process called co-construction.
Right, at the core of it would be deep understanding of core mathematical concepts, not so much the application of procedures, right? I also think that if I think about what I observed at Railside, the way that they thought about what it meant to do math also included things like the person who asks really good questions is someone who's really contributing to the community. The person who knows how to make space for other people's voices. So also the kind of social processes around the math. You could imagine an assessment that included those two, that gets at what are the set of skills and, I don't know what the right word is, what are the set of skills that allow a really wonderful mathematical conversation to happen in a classroom that would be even beyond the kind of pure content knowledge. I think when I was talking about assessment more generally, I was also thinking about things like, how do we assess whether a curriculum allows students to have a joyful experience? Right? How do we assess whether students feel empowered, engaged, in command of their own learning? Again, in addition to just the content pieces, which we do with varying degrees of success and precision, what are those meta pieces that we know in this room are really important? We actually never assess at the classroom level to see if we're creating the spaces to make those things possible.
I'm one of the younger faculty members in our department. I have an ability to, I think, talk to our students in a particular way, sort of like a big brother or something like that. And how can we get students to, I think, one of our main goals is to sort of get students to make up for all the missed time with practice. And so we're realizing that the issue with fractions is not that they don't understand, it's that they just haven't practiced. And so now when you get another fraction, you're like, I've never seen this before, I haven't practiced with it. I think part of that is creating spaces on campus where students can go and be social. And so I was actually talking to a colleague earlier about the work that Uri Treisman did back at Berkeley with the PDP program. Yeah. And I think one of the biggest findings from that study was that students were not, the students that were not doing well in calculus were sort of hanging with a group of friends here, and then they were studying in isolation. So I think creating spaces for students to sort of, for me, to make up some of that missed time so that we're eating dinner and doing math. And so I think part of that is, for my faculty, is me asking other professors, like, we need to stay a little bit later. Most people leave around 5 or 6, but what does it mean to be with students in the evening when they're doing their work? I think from a classroom space, providing alternatives where students don't feel like the classroom is the only place that they can learn, and then coming up with student leaders, students that you see doing well. It's a really motivating factor to have a peer say, hey guys, let's go to the library, versus your professor saying, you guys need to go to the library. And I think sort of allowing students that space and that voice sort of allows us a little bit to get through some of those struggles, particularly with like just content coverage.
Well, I mean, I can speak to the teachers that I studied, which is they were explicit about reframing who got viewed as smart in a classroom space. So taking a student who might be a student of color, might be a low-income student, might just not have developed a really strong mathematical identity, and they had this notion of catching them doing something smart, right, and calling it out. So really this attention, so part of what you're talking about is the way that social hierarchies in the world get reproduced in classrooms. Teachers can have a really strong hand in disrupting that reproduction of social hierarchy by according status in a more equitable and kind of wider range of ways. I mean, I almost want to... Niril Shah has done some work in this area, so you should talk to him.
Did you want to comment now?
Yeah,
no?
you should.
Oh, okay. All right.
I mean, he's actually developed a whole technology to support these practices.
Oh, shit. Oh.
I'll be your hype person if you...
Next session, right? Next session?
You're speaking this afternoon.
All right, yes. Coming up.
I'll add one comment.
Coming up next, please, Nathan.
I think being in a seemingly racially homogenous space, I've found the value of thinking about class really matters, and how we need to sort of make sure that's part of the intersections that we're examining when we're talking about race, language, because it really, I think, talks about those opportunity structures. It helps us sort of understand that a little bit better when we use that in an intersectional framework. Yeah.
Okay. Let's give our panelists a round.